some one-offs or incidents, as it called them, of brutality against the detainees, but insisted they were isolated occurrences. At this early stage in my research, I had little doubt about the story slowly unfolding from Britain's official archive. When I presented my dissertation proposal to my department in the winter of 1997, I was intending to write a history of the success of Britain's civilizing mission in the detention camps of Kenya. I soon returned to Britain and then went on to Kenya for an exhaustive look into the official colonial records. It wasn't long before I began questioning my earlier view of the camps and the British colonial government. I found that countless documents pertaining to the detention camps either were missing from Britain's Public Record Office and the Kenya National Archives, or were still classified as confidential some 50 years after the Mau Mau War. The British were meticulous record keepers in Kenya and elsewhere in their empire, making the absence of documentation on the camps all the more curious. I came to learn that the colonial government had intentionally destroyed many of these missing files in massive bonfires on the eve of its 1963 retreat from Kenya. To give a sense of the destructive scale, 3 different departments within the colonial government kept individual files for each of the reported 80,000 detainees in the camps. This means there should have been at least 240,000 individual detainee files in the official archives. I spent days and days searching for them in the catalogs of Britain's coldly efficient Public Record Office and in the dusty but orderly file shelves of the Kenya National Archives, but in the end, I unearthed only a few hundred in Nairobi and came up empty-handed in London. After years of combing through what remains in the official archives, I discovered that there was a pattern to Britain's cleansing of the records. Any ministry or department that dealt with the unsavory side of detention was pretty well emptied of its files, whereas those that ostensibly addressed detainee reform or Britain's civilizing mission were left fairly intact. This was hardly accidental and explains why my first cursory reading of the official files in London generated a picture of a relatively benign system of detention in colonial Kenya. Even the most assiduous purges, however, often fail to clean up all the incriminating evidence. I spent years going through file upon file of official documents, looking for anything that pertained to the detention camps. Some days I found nothing of use. Other times I discovered nuggets of information that I added to a growing pile of evidence. It was a tedious and sometimes frustrating process, as I struggled simply to identify all of the different camps. There is no single remaining document that lists them all, and to reconstruct the chain of colonial authority responsible for their day-to-day operations. Many times I would grow weary of finding little of any use, then hit on a document that provided just another small piece to the puzzle. Mercifully, there were also the handful of days when I would come across entire files filled with rich evidence, files like the ones bursting with letters written by detainees during their time in the camps and addressed to high-ranking colonial officials. In them, the detainees provided vivid accounts of what their lives were like behind the wire, accounts that challenged any notion that the British detention camps were civilizing. Other revelations in the archives came not from any single document or file, but rather from the cumulative effect of sustained research. Over time, I developed a certain sense that told me when something just didn't seem right. For instance, given the sheer number of detainees referenced in the files, the official number of 80,000 detained began to seem more and more suspicious to me. Upon closer scrutiny, it was clear that the British had provided misleading detention numbers, giving daily average figures, or net rather than gross figures. In other words, the official number did not take into account all those detainees who had already entered and exited the camps. By going back through the documents and piecing together the intake and release rates, I determined that the number of Africans detained was at least 2 times and more likely 4 times the official figure, or somewhere between 160,000 and 320,000. Something else nagged at me about these numbers.